Good evening, friends. Welcome to Violence with Mark Piccini. I'm going to talk today about the culmination of a decade's work looking at or researching representations of violence, and particularly what it is that draws audiences, and particularly audiences such as myself who've been fortunate enough to avoid, more often than not avoid direct violence in our day-to-day lives, why we are attracted to these exaggerated images of violence in the form of, tropes and characters like serial killers and those kind of psychological aberrations. But for my research, particularly the way that we look to parts of the world, particular regions, and particular kinds of people for violence. So my work, not because of any kind of ethnic or fundamental relationship with Latin America, has found itself amongst Latin American literature. And I've been looking at a handful of work that stands against or bucks the trend of exaggerated Hollywood-style violence in Latin America, what we would call Latin American violence or generic Latin American violence. And much smarter people than myself have articulated that notion and written books about the way that violence in Latin America, the reality of violence in Latin America is taken and manifests culturally as disproportionately massive, essential, or an ontological reality. My work is about how audiences and why audiences and the effect of audiences being heavily libidinally invested in violence. So it's grounded in psychoanalytic theory, why we like the things we like, why we do the things we do, how we see ourselves as likable in the world when we navigate through it. And it's grounded in a broader form of anti-humanist theory, I suppose. So one of the books that I look at, I've very much written on the coattails of this book, I make no mistake about it, is by the ever-contentious, much maligned, perhaps appropriately, Slavoj Žižek. And it's a book called Violence. And it does something, I think it seems quite simple, which is to designate between, broadly speaking, two types of violence. The kind of violence wherein the category of violence wherein that Latin American violence I described before sits comfortably, is what he calls subjective violence. And I'll read from the book in a second, but subjective violence is that kind of directly visible, in-your-face, blood splatter violence that can't be denied. It's the harrowing images of genocide coming out of the Gaza Strip at the moment as we record this. It's the names of criminals and the details of their crimes that come out in court reporting, and that are then waxed over at great length by true crime podcasters for various reasons. It's those really obvious signs of violence. But then the other category is what Žižek calls objective violence, and it's much harder to pin down. In a legal sense, in particular, it's much harder to point to it as a crime. The sphere of guilt, the sphere of culpability is for this kind of violence is enormous. It absolutely includes me, and unfortunately, it almost certainly includes you. The kinds of violence that get spoken about as in terms of objective violence aren't crimes that you'll find in a legal textbook now or in the past. Probably objective violence is better summed up as in terms of harm, which is very much the way that recent criminology and semiology in particular has moved away from the subjective violence of what we classify as crime to the objective violence of harm. So the harm that we do we were talking before about the harm that somebody does by entering an institution like academia and pulling the ladder up with them. That's harmful. That kind of brutality, that mercantile approach to success is harmful, but it's not criminal. It's actively celebrated in almost every facet of life as success, but it's clearly harmful. It creates and reiterates, or it is a form of violence that creates and reiterates inequality. But enough of that. Let me read from the first couple of pages of Žižek's book. It's been a while since I've glanced at this. I feel like I've quoted it and transcribed it so many times that rereading the original will probably destroy my ego ideal. I'll collapse, or I'll have a kind of an existential crisis. But given that it's Žižek's work, it's probably got some vulgarity in it and some stupid jokes. So let's have a read, shall we? Does that sound good? That's good. All right. The introduction begins, "The Tyrant's Bloody Robe" is the subtitle. There is an old story about a worker suspected of stealing. Every evening, as he leaves the factory, the wheelbarrow he rolls in front of him is carefully inspected. The guards can find nothing. It's always empty. Finally, the penny drops. What the worker is stealing are the wheelbarrows themselves. Which is a great idea. I wish that he hadn't written that, because I would have tried to make money stealing wheelbarrows. But regardless, he says, if there is a unifying thesis that runs through the bric-a-brac of reflections on violence that follow, it is that a similar paradox holds true for violence. At the forefront of our minds, the obvious signals of violence are acts of crime and terror, civil unrest, international conflict. But we should learn to step back, to disentangle ourselves from the fascinating lure of this directly visible subjective violence, violence performed by a clearly identifiable agent. We need to perceive the contours of the background which generates such outbursts. A step back enables us to identify a violence that sustains our very efforts to fight violence and promote tolerance. That really is an idea or a provocation that I come back to constantly in the book that I'm writing at the moment, but that has guided me in all of the work, because that's precisely what the authors, the creative writers, if you want to call them that I look at from Latin America do. Their books are certainly engaged with real-world, quite easily contextualizable instances of violence, things that you can look up on Wikipedia. They're harrowing violence, but they are concrete enough, so to speak, to have a dedicated Wikipedia page. But what they do is constantly pull our focus back to that background of objective violence, where we are, and where we are potentially culpable by the same token. So what they do is they create a mirror that reflects our perversity. The way that we anticipate and expect subjective violence from certain individuals or groups of people, and just how heavily libidinally invested we are in that reality, in their violent reality, and the way that we manage to extricate ourselves from, the blood splatter, from the scene of the crime, as if we're neutral observers, engaging with and consuming a world that exists without us, as if there's some impervious border between us and the other violent realities. So to continue reading, this is the starting point, Žižek says, of his book, perhaps even the axiom. Subjective violence is the most visible portion of a triumvirate that also includes two objective kinds of violence. First, there is the symbolic violence embodied in language and its forms, what Heidegger called our house of being. And we shall see later, this violence is not only at work in the obvious and extensively studied cases of incitement and of the relations of social domination reproduced in our habitual speech forms. In other words, this is not primarily a work of post-structuralism. Second, there is what I call systemic violence, or the often catastrophic consequences of the smooth functioning of our economic and political systems. So, to expound or to unpack that, this is one of Žižek's less psychoanalytic books. It's a book where he's really engaged in sort of critiques of the political economy and the systems of power that exist. I've taken the focus in this book, in my work, but I have a much more Lacanian psychoanalytic approach, which Žižek develops in a number of his other works, but less so in this work. And basically, alongside those economies that he mentioned, the economic economy, political systems, the one that I'm looking at is the libidinal system. So the system of desire, the way that we desire some body else or some other place that can enjoy for us, that is violent when we are not, that is hypersexual when we are not, that is exotic when we perhaps consider ourselves to be anemic yet comfortable people. The way that we enjoy at their or that they enjoy, it would appear initially to be at our expense, but in fact the way that we are projecting our enjoyment onto them and putting them in positions of precarity. So it is a non-material economy. It's like I said, it's a libidinal economy. It's tied up with things that you can't pin down, that can't be quantified, desire, what Lacan calls jouissance, excess enjoyment, but it is directly tied to political and economic economies. I mean, you just have to look at the highest selling films, TV shows, podcasts on Netflix and on, I don't know, whatever people listen to podcasts on Spotify or SoundCloud. They're often dealing with violence, antisocial behavior, true crime, all of those sorts of things. So these desires or these kind of perverse appetites do have a direct, quantifiable, marketable component as well. He continues, the catch is that subjective and objective violence cannot be perceived from the same standpoint. Subjective violence is experienced as such against the background of a non-violent zero level. It is seen as a perturbation of the normal, peaceful state of things. However, objective violence is precisely the violence inherent to this normal state of things. Objective violence is invisible since it sustains the very zero-level standard against which we perceive something as subjectively violent. Systemic violence is thus something like the notorious dark matter of physics, the counterpart to an all-too visible subjective violence. It may be invisible, but it has to be taken into account if one is to make sense of what otherwise seem to be irrational explosions of subjective violence. So that really is, I now realize that I should probably go back and write this somewhere in my book, but that's the crux of what we're getting at there, which is that you can't, or at least Žižek contends that you can't adequately perceive and pay attention to subjective and objective violence simultaneously. And that is absolutely the point that I'm making in my work, which looks at when we are fascinated by the lure of subjective violence, when we're sitting there watching the 400th carbon copy of Cocaine Kingpin Pablo Escobar on our screen, whether it's, who's played him, Benicio del Toro, someone else, whether it's Narcos or whatever, when we're watching this larger-than-life explosive subjective violence, the last thing we're seeing or thinking about is us, and the effect that our desire for that subjective violence which we are consuming, the effect that it actually has. Our own objective violence is obfuscated by the explosive reality of subjective violence. And that's what all of the books that I look at do. In one way or another, they draw us in using the tried and true methods of luring us in with the promise of grotesque, generic Latin American violence. And then once they lure us there, they provide no answers, barely any context for that violence. That violence becomes a backdrop if it doesn't dissipate entirely. And what we're left with is a handful of basically perverts, in a sense, narrators, wayward narrators who more often than not have appeared in Bolaño's case, have appeared in Latin America for completely divergent reasons and are from the global north. So they've ended up in the global south from the global north where their own perversions, their own inherent violent tendencies are revealed in the mirror of subjective violence in the South. The point being that their stories force us to contemplate our own objective violence, our own role in the perpetuation of the explosive instances of subjective violence that Žižek mentions. My closing thought on Slavoj Žižek is there's a couple of important addendums. One thing he writes in this book might be directly contradicted in one of the four other books he publishes per month. He says lots and lots and lots of contentious things. He was once a kind of darling of the left, and then now has been castigated and thrown out for his various problematic views. I completely acknowledge all of those realities at the same time as I fervently adhere to the understanding of violence that he's developed largely over his theoretical career. I should probably say that I am also a monstrous cretin in many ways, as all of us are. I think that is important to say when you're talking about Žižek and you're talking about violence and you're using any kind of psychoanalytic theory, is that the issues, the symptoms, the problems lie within all of us. They certainly can't be, although they so often are, localized in individual figures and scapegoats. So we shouldn't throw out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. We need to keep thinking about theory and all its manifestations, and basically not let academics put themselves on the pedestal that where they feel they belong. And we're all complicated, multifaceted people, and capable of theorizing, and capable of contradicting our own theories, and capable of, for want of a better term, fucking up.